Welcome to everybody who's come in. Thanks very much for doing so. This is a launch and press conference for a call from a group of academics in Ireland for particularly, it's a deliberate intervention or injection into the general election campaign, where we're calling for a specific response to the climate change challenge. And the specific response we're suggesting is the establishment of what we're calling a Citizens' Convention for a Post-Carbon Ireland. Okay, and by that we mean a very substantive, large-scale engagement that would allow every citizen up and down the country, in every parish and every community, the opportunity to learn about, to understand, to engage with, to bring forward their own proposals and ideas and thoughts about how we engage proactively rather than reactively with the effects of climate change in particular on our society, but of course on societies all around the world. And we have a role in that because there's a global interaction in climate change. So that's what we're here for. You're all very welcome. Thanks for coming. We discovered at very late notice that this slot was clashing with the launch of the Green Party manifesto. So unfortunately we may have lost some media participants who might otherwise have been here, but thanks very much to those who have made it. We very much appreciate that. So my name is Barry McMullen. I'm based in Dublin City University. Just to say very briefly the genesis of this particular idea, I found myself speaking with Pader just before Christmas. We had both been engaged with the Paris conference, the UN climate change conference in Paris just the week before. We were both back in Dublin, and we were exchanging views about the significance of that conference. Of course it was very significant. It's a genuine breakthrough to have this agreement among all the members of that UN process, over 190 of them, all the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, on a specific goal to limit global temperature increase to much less than 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees over pre-industrial. Now globally we're already more or less at 1 degree over pre-industrial. So that commitment, and indeed to limit it to 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial if at all possible, that's an important target, and it's based in science. It's based on the best projections we can make. It's a very complex system, but on the best projections we can make on the potential impacts. We're already suffering significant impacts from climate change, but the best guesses we can make, and the risks really, because this is now a risk management process, that's what we should aim for. It's all very well saying that's what we should aim for, and everybody agreed to that. The question is how we do it. And the Paris Agreement is really just a framework for how we do it, so it's kind of a bit bizarre. There was a huge amount of discussion and coverage and attention to the climate talks because it's a big event and you can focus attention on it. But the message that seems to have come away is, well, it was a success. So that means we can stop worrying about it because it was a success. So that problem is now fixed. But of course, the outcome from the Paris Agreement is not success in that sense. It's to go back to all the parties and say, well, now you know the scale of the challenge, you've agreed on the scale of the challenge, now you each have to play your part and design your own pathway that is commensurate with this target that we've all agreed to. And that's a challenge for Ireland, it's a challenge for every country in the world. But it is a huge challenge. It's very, very, to meet that goal of limiting temperature rise to well below 2 degrees is very, very challenging. And that's why we felt, as a group of academics, the conversation I had with Pader, I was saying, we've got an election coming up. Really, this should be part of the election conversation. And what we really need is a large-scale engagement from the public to understand this challenge and have the opportunity to make their voices heard on it. And how do we, what as academics, what role do we have in that? And Pader, of course, said, that's an excellent idea, Barry. Why don't you do something about it? But no, seriously, he said, look, that actually is a good idea. And if we had a text, if we had a proposal that there would be a lot of engagement from the academic community to back that up and to support it. So we went away and we developed this proposal for a citizens' convention for really participatory democracy, okay, for bringing it out of the hurly-burly of the 5-year election cycle, which is very difficult, and the utmost admiration for politicians, for anybody who's willing to go forward for political office. It's a tough way of life in many ways, but in a sense the system compels them to take a short-term view. But here we've got a problem, a challenge that requires long-term thinking, and lots of politicians I've spoken to say, well, we can only do that if the people support us in doing that. So, but people can only support them in doing that if the people understand or engage and given the opportunity to do that. So this is why we came up with this particular proposal, and we reached out then to colleagues across the entire Irish university system, and we have today 29 people from all 7 universities in Ireland across all disciplines. I'm an engineer, Patter's a political scientist. We have people specialising in energy, we have people specialising in sustainability. I see Charlotte Holland, Pat Brereton in communications and journalism, Ethna, languages, and all of these disciplines, because this is one of these so-called wicked problems. All of these areas interact and have a role to play, and that's why it actually was not a problem. We probably could have had 100 academics who would willingly have supported this, but it was just the sheer time we had available to organise and coordinate. So we're very pleased to have reached this point. We're pleased the website went live this morning with all the documentation and the call, and there's a petition that individual citizens can join in with. We will be emailing this directly to certainly all the parties later on today and asking them to formally respond and say whether they support this action or not, and we'll be logging that on the website over the next week. So that's the pitch. I'm going to invite I think John Sweeney, Ireland's foremost climate scientist, to give us a quick perspective on why this problem demands this kind of response.
Thanks, Barry. Well, over the past week to 10 days, I've learned a new phrase, and you've all learned a new phrase, and the phrase has been fiscal space. And of course that is an indication of what resources the next government will have to play with in terms of economic, I suppose, opportunities. But the phrase I want to introduce to you this morning is a phrase called climate space, because just like a fixed amount of money, we have a fixed amount of emissions left to us to use up. And we have approximately in Ireland 206,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions left to us till 2020, if we are to meet the obligations which all of our political parties have signed up to, and signed up to in a solemn declaration way back as far as 2007. And I suppose the question that I wanted to pose with you today is, well, how should we use that climate space? Will we, as Mario Draghi said, do everything that's necessary to comply with those obligations that we entered into in good faith almost a decade ago now? And that climate space is not just a national climate space. We also have, of course, a global climate space to remember. We have about 245 gigatons of burn left before we enter dangerous climate change territory. And we're going through it at the rate of about 11 gigatons per year at the moment. So just as with fiscal space, it's imperative that we take steps necessary to manage the future of our climate space. And to me, the first responsibility of any government is a duty of care to its citizens, and a duty of care especially to those that come after us in this country and on the planet in general. So I think it's incumbent that we have the kind of discussion that Barry talked about in order that we come to a consensus, a democratic consensus, where all sectors of society, all strands of society have their viewpoints expressed in a fair and balanced way, and that we come to a decision about how we use the available climate space remaining to Ireland Inc. in such a way that it's not excessively colonised by very powerful vested interest groups or very powerful economic interest groups as well. So I think that's why the proposal that's before you today for democratising, if you like, this whole issue of climate change in an apolitical way, this is not an NGO operation, this is not a political operation, as Barry said. It's an attempt to bring the scientific realities of climate change to the population of Ireland and to make them aware of the choices that we face as a country for especially our children in the years ahead. Because without having that open discussion, without being aware that we all have, if you like, an opportunity to shape the future of Ireland in this key area, then we're liable to end up in a cul-de-sac, which I think will do none of us any good in the years ahead. So that's why I think it's so important that we have this open and frank discussion today from an academic and scientific point of view.
Thanks, John. Sorry, I should have introduced everybody at the table at the start. So John Sweeney, climate science from Maynooth University, Cara Augustenberg, environmental and climate specialist in University College Dublin, and Peadar Kirby of University of Limerick, political scientist. So I'm going to invite Peadar now, as a political scientist, to comment on the role of this kind of engagement with citizens for this kind of problem.
Thanks, Barry. The idea we have in mind isn't particularly prescriptive. In other words, we don't have very firm ideas of what this citizens' convention might look like. What we do seek really are two fundamental dimensions. One is that we engage citizens as widely as possible in an educational endeavour to draw their attention to the utmost seriousness of what we're facing. This seems to be really badly needed in Ireland. I mean, I travel quite a bit, I teach abroad. I'm very struck at just how behind the curve we are in Ireland, how little the issues of climate change are impacting on citizens, on the business sector, on local government, on national government, on academics. I mean, I'm constantly shocked at the ignorance of Irish third-level students compared to third-level students, for example, in Spain, where I teach quite regularly. So we really have a problem here in Ireland. And so therefore that's the first principle, the principle of really engaging and educating our population. And the second principle then is of engaging in a citizens' conversation about the inevitable trade-offs that we face. I mean, we've already had a number of times discussions in the media about the challenges to Irish agriculture, which is, in my experience, a constant that comes up when one talks to politicians about this issue. But there seems to be a sort of a blockage, which I think has to do with perhaps vested interests, over a wide-ranging discussion about the realities of the evidence and what it means for agriculture. I'm just picking agriculture as one sector, which in the Irish case, of course, as we all know, is a particularly urgent one. But there are the sectors of energy, of transport, of house building, of industry. I mean, all of these are equally important. So we need a national conversation that, as Barry has said, is beyond the political process, in the sense that it's not the province of one particular political party. That all our political parties, all our politicians, and our civil society, broadly defined, comes on board and is part of this discussion in order to face the trade-offs as a society and to make the transition that John has spoken about. So we have a number of examples in the Irish political process. It seems to me that we could together design a robust process that would include dimensions of the experience, for example, of the Constitutional Convention that we had under the outgoing government, that would include dimensions of the consultations that regularly take place if we're having white papers on different topics. I've been part of them myself on a number of occasions on foreign policy, on international development policy, where you'll hold meetings around the country which will be addressed by experts, and this has a feed-in then into the options presented in white papers. These are the sorts of examples we had. You'll all be aware that the Taoiseach has pledged a Citizens' Convention on the issue of the 8th Amendment of abortion in the next Dáil, and we had hearings on abortion in the outgoing Dáil, that were highly regarded as a model of how, at parliamentary level, we can have a civilised discussion about issues that we find very difficult. These are just dimensions I mention. And so our call is for a citizens' convention, a national conversation that's adequate to the task of the enormous challenges we face to move into the space that John has outlined. And that this will, in our view, need something robust and long-lasting. We think that it would need at least about 3 years to do this adequately, to do it in a way that does really engage the citizenry as a whole. But apart from those dimensions, we're not prescriptive about what form it might take. All we're asking for is parties to sign up to this ambition of putting in place this citizens' conversation, this act of deliberative democracy about this enormously complex and urgent issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, I'm going to invite Cara now to give her perspectives on this initiative.
Thanks, Barry. So I'll just speak from my own point of view as one of the signatories of this call, and just to say that I was really excited when Barry approached me with this idea, because to be honest, it's not often that we see academics climbing down from their ivory towers and engaging on political issues. And I think the reason that we've all come together now and actually are moving away from academia and into this kind of sphere of policy and society is because in all of our disciplines, we're seeing the impacts of climate change. From my point of view, I'm seeing the environmental impacts getting worse and worse, but I think Barry would see the engineering impacts, and some of you would see the societal impacts and the justice impacts around migration and whatnot. And they're endless, these impacts. But at the same time, there's not a word about the transition and the need to address this in any of the major political parties. So I think that's the impetus for why we all got together and finally said we need to really be active in this space. The Paris Climate Agreement was the most historic thing, and certainly in my generation, to have 195 countries come together, because what we've agreed to do is evolve from the Industrial Revolution, move away from our fossil fuel driven past and toward a clean energy in society, and we only have 3 decades to do this. So this has to happen now. This has to happen in our generation, and we are the transition generation that's going to witness this. So it's huge, and that's why we need to have this conversation right away. I mean, there are going to be trade-offs. There are going to be winners and losers, and we need to start talking about what trade-offs are we willing to make around that space. I mean, I had a canvasser at my door last week, and I asked him what his candidate was doing about the low carbon transition. What was his candidate's plan? And that candidate didn't even, or that canvasser didn't even know what the low carbon transition was. So this is the most historic thing we've faced into in our generation, and yet most people don't even know that this is where we're going and this is where we're headed. So I think it's that urgency about our changing climate and that lack of acknowledgement from our elected representatives on what their plan is, that is the impetus for what is an unprecedented initiative from the academic community that I'm really proud to be part of. So what we're asking for now is for the public to join us in this call, so that our next government can't ignore the need for this conversation and how we begin the low carbon transition. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Cara. So just finally to say, in my perspective on this, what has been happening in Ireland to date has been essentially a default of waiting for things to happen and then react. Okay, so we wait for a fodder crisis, we wait for flooding, we wait for a refugee crisis in Europe, and we send our navy, and that's great. But this is much better, and in Ireland, above any country in the world, we should have learnt this lesson, that it's much better to anticipate and work with the future challenges rather than to turn your back and wait for them to come upon you and then scramble to try and respond. Okay, and we know it's not that like climate change is suddenly going to stop because we've all woken up and started talking about it. Climate change is already built up. There's a lot more to come, but we can limit how severe it gets if we act now. But it's not about acting in 2050. As Cara says, it's this 30 years. It's really critical, and it's this first 5 years, because it starts now. So really engaging in trade-offs. The final thing I just want to say, and it's buried in the text, if anyone can spot it, but the one thing we do want to emphasise is that we're not proposing some sort of device for an incoming government to say, well, that's great, we don't have to do anything for 3 years because we're going to ask the people what to do. Of course, there are things that can and should be done immediately. An obvious one is that in a world where we already know that something of the order of 80% of known fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground if we're going to respect that 2-degree target, a moratorium on looking for further resources of fossil fuels is, you know, a very straightforward thing to act on immediately. So there are things that an incoming government can and should do immediately, and this is not, as I say, to give some excuse for not doing them, but it is to look to hand over to the people and enable the people, and I emphasise enable the people to engage, to learn, but to respond and bring forward their own ideas and vision for how we can have a flourishing post-carbon society. But that will only come about by starting now to embrace and move towards it, as opposed to turning our backs and pretending that there isn't something that we have to deal with. So with that, I'll just invite anybody in the room who would like to add anything or pose any questions to us. So the floor is open.
Peter, why do you think it's so hard for political parties, because they're not click, to actually embrace the message as something to sell to the electorate?
I think it's, I mean, this is an issue I think and write about an awful lot. This is a global issue. It's not an issue just to do with Irish political parties. Why is it so hard for the global community to get its head around the overwhelming scientific evidence? Never in the history of the world have we had a consensus of the world scientists around an issue like we have like this. Why is it so hard? Why have our political systems around the world been so late in the day in coming up to the mark on this? So that's the bigger context. In Ireland, however, I think we have a particularly, I think we're particularly behind the curve, as I said already, and that I think has to do with the localism of our political system. I organised a meeting last night in Cloughjordan of our local candidates, and our Fine Gael TD Marcella Corcoran-Kennedy, who is interested in climate change herself, made the point that nobody, apart from the Eco-Village in Cloughjordan, has brought up on the doorstep climate change. So it's not coming from the citizens, therefore the parties don't feel under any pressure. I myself have given evidence before the Oireachtas Committee on the Environment on the climate change bill, and the one issue that all TDs and senators brought up was agriculture. And the basic message was, well, we can't do anything about climate change if it damages our agriculture. And the bigger conclusion that I draw from all this is that we're not willing to, or we're only willing to face the scientific evidence to the extent to which it doesn't interfere with the dominant socio-economic paradigm of a growth economy, which is really carbon intensive. And our solution, and I'm not just talking about Ireland, I think globally, by and large, politicians put their faith in technology, that technology is going to save us. And the experts will say, of course we need technology, but we need fundamental behavioural change in terms of our patterns of consumption, of mobility, of energy use, etc. That technology alone won't do it. So the dominant socio-economic paradigm is really being challenged, I think, by the evidence of climate change. That's why, as Barry put it there, it is very interesting that everything is dated from the beginning of the industrial era. And we date back the beginning of this problem to the beginning of the industrial era. So it does pose fundamental questions about the way in which we organise our industrial society. That's my own personal view. But I do think, therefore, that the challenge for our leaders at all levels, including our academic leaders, I'm very critical of just how little academia has taken on these challenges by and large, is to be willing to critically address those aspects of the dominant way in which we think about how we organise our economy and our society, if they conflict with the overwhelming scientific evidence of the damage that this is doing to our future on this planet.
Can I say something about that, though? I think underlying what you're saying is a really fundamental problem that will have to be addressed as part of this. And I mean, it's in your question. Why is there such reluctance? And of course you're right, things like agriculture and so on, but there's another question. Why are human beings reluctant to engage with problems that have long-term consequences. And if that isn't part of the whole consideration, we won't find solutions, because even if we solve the agriculture problem, we solve the, I don't know, education problem, we still are dealing with, as you said, the fundamental reluctance in human beings to deal with things long term. So that needs to be looked at from a psychological and a sociological point of view. I mean, I'm not qualified in that area, but I think clearly part of it is that generally speaking, people are reckoning with 70 years and 10. And therefore, in the same way we can't contemplate infinity or death or any of these things, we also can't really deal. We're not, I mean this, we're not in a practical way able to engage with long-term problems individually, and therefore not as a society. And if we don't face up to that, there's a risk that we'll just be haranguing people about what they should do, but each of us will feel, yeah, but I don't know how to start to deal, you know, I know I should, but I can't, so I'll deal with something else. So there's a danger of getting too caught up in the fine print, and I know your document, or our document, really wants to avoid that. But I think we have to state as well that there are fundamental human problems about grasping big issues, and we need to see what are the underlying fears there, and how can they be addressed to empower us all. I think that's really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ethna. I think we should emphasise, as hopefully humble academics, we don't know that this will work. We don't know that this is the answer. We don't know that this will decisively change the trajectory of Irish society. But we do know that we have to do something. We have to try things.
Yes.
And this is the way humanity has always developed. When you're up against it, you don't just keep doing the same thing you've been doing. You try something different.
And you empower, though, that's my point. We need to empower people to overcome their natural reluctance, fear, inhibitions about long-term planning and change.
Okay. Sorry, George, that's...
Yeah, well, the thing which I wonder about, I was listening on the radio sometime this morning and I heard Pat Kenny interviewing somebody about allergies. And Pat makes the point about you can now get poo pills. And I was kind of amazed at the whole conversation that people want to have these tests for €250 because they might be sick and so on. I wonder, is there an extent to which the public don't realise that we're sick? Don't realise that climate-wise, you know, John has beaten the drum, I've heard him for years, trying to explain what the issues are, and it all sounds very interesting, you know, that kind of way, like, but they don't really realise what you're talking about. And so you're saying, let's have a conversation about something that people haven't really grasped the seriousness of. You know, I wonder
but George, one of the reasons is because the media have covered it so badly.
Yes.
You know, I think all media people have to recognise that. The Guardian did recently.
Sell well.
No, it doesn't, of course not. But that itself indicates that, I mean, if it's only things that sell well that we'll cover, this is a crisis over our future on this planet.
Like I know, in my case, I used to do economics for years. If there was a cough in the economic circles or in business circles, I'd have it on television and radio.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult to get.
No, I
I
accept the difficulties.
It's very difficult to get environment.
Can I just specifically invite Cara in a second, but Pat Brereton is one of the other people supporting this initiative, and so Pat, maybe putting on a professional media hat, you might want to comment on it specifically.
Communicating the environmental issue is difficult, and as Ethna was saying, it is a very long-term strategy. I mean, I've been asked to write a chapter of a book on food and sort of how food is represented in the film in sort of documentaries, and we need to connect with people's sensibilities. So whether it's sort of emissions, whether it's flooding, you need to find ways to sort of grasp that connection with people. And as we're saying, the long term is problematic because people don't live, and if they don't have a sensibility beyond themselves or seeing how it's going to affect their children, then really care. People are selfish beings then. So they're only thinking it's the economy, stupid. That's the usual mantra for most political rhetoric, because that's what really matters, getting jobs. But why can't it be green jobs? Why can't you have sustainable jobs? Why can't you look and see sustainability in a different sort of that paradigm shift needs to be made for people, and people need to see that. So you have to appeal to people's self-interest, but also their benevolence and their connection with other people. You know, the idea of migration and how that's going to have a huge effect on Ireland and everywhere, but people may not see that. So having those connections and making those registers is what academic scholars have to do as well as cultural historians, and we need to sort of show that.
But maybe, as Karen was saying, there is the ivory tower element of it. We need to get down and dirty a bit more in the whole business.
Sorry, Cara, you
know what we're doing now.
But one final thing, Peter, connected to that. You said that the students in Spain are much more clued in.
Yeah.
Now you must have thought about why. Why?
Because I think, I mean, I didn't finish the issue about the localism of our political system. I think that at the level of our political system, it's really a very bottom-up political system, as we all know. And the policy-making apparatuses, that's the plural of apparatus, in our political parties is really relatively weak compared to political parties in other countries. So that's one dimension of why we're not getting leadership as a society on this. I mean, the Spanish Socialist Party, when they were in government the last time, were much more proactive in terms of the whole energy sphere, for example. In other words, there are political parties who, when they get to power, put climate change on serious actions on climate change on the political agenda. We don't have any political party proposing that in Ireland apart from the Greens, who aren't going to get into power on their own, certainly. And therefore I think there is a wider recognition around, not just because of that, but because there's more leadership. I also find, for example, within academia there's more leadership, there's more discussion about climate change. When I go to lecture in Spain, I'm not lecturing on climate change, I'm lecturing on social change, but I'm asked to include climate change as an absolutely central dimension of that. How many Irish academics, if they're talking about social change in Ireland, include climate change as being a central part of that? Virtually none. I mean, that's the shocking thing. That hasn't got on the agenda of the social sciences in Ireland by and large. It is on the agenda of the social sciences in Spain. There's much more output. I'm co-editing a book at the moment which is being published in Britain in English, but most of it is by Spanish and French academics coming out of the University of Valencia in Spain, because there's so little work going on among English-speaking academics on these issues. And it's entitled Transition into a Post-Carbon Society, Austerity, Degrowth and Well-being. I mean, that gives you a sense of the theme.
The title of it is frightening. You want to go like this and go back to bed.
But these are the issues.
But, I mean,
but aren't you now falling into what Edna
I'm only
was
trying
saying?
to sell the story, right?
But I'm saying open the discussion, George. We have to open the discussion. We have to show that there's opportunities here.
I don't want to dump on George for one thing,
Yeah.
but Cara has been waiting to
just
come
to
in
say,
on this point.
you know, the world has signed on to Paris, so I think the dialogue and the conversation around climate problems has evolved into climate solutions. And I did a TED Talk at UCD back in December where I looked at, in 3 decades, my daughter will be roughly my age, and what would her life look like in a fossil-free Ireland. And what I found is, regardless of whether or not we did it for climate change, that world is way better. It's healthier, it's quieter, it's cleaner, it's safer. The co-benefits to everything you need to do about climate are enormous. And that's the message we need to get across. We need to stop talking so much about climate problems and be talking about climate solutions.
Yeah, it's back to we shouldn't waste a good crisis. This is an extraordinary point in human evolution, okay, and geological or evolutionary timescales. We've been such a successful species that we've outgrown our planet, okay, but we don't have somewhere else to go, and it's us living today who find ourselves in this predicament. But it's a huge opportunity. If we want to look forward, we can see, well, how can we use this transition that we're going to go through anyway? There is going to be a transition. There is going to be a post-carbon human world. Okay, that's going to happen anyway. So how do we use it to build a better, fairer, more with greater human happiness and greater human welfare? And those things are possible, but they're not possible on business as usual. It's not possible by you cannot universalize to all humanity the way of life that we in Ireland have, for example. That is not possible within the capacity of this planet. But that doesn't mean there aren't ways of life that will be wonderful, that can be universalized. But until we start having those discussions and look at those opportunities, we're not going to chart a course towards that world. And I think in Ireland, you know, notwithstanding all the things that Peadar has said, we are also still reeling. We're in the aftermath of the economic shocks that we have been impacted by. A lot of people have suffered very directly and very locally and still are suffering. So in those circumstances, there is a natural psychological reaction of hunkering down and not wanting to look around. But, you know, I think there is a huge opportunity from that baseline to say, well, okay, hang on, it's time to take a deep breath and look to the future again. and look at the opportunities of building a better future. Yes, there's going to be rocky, it's going to be challenging, there's going to be difficulties, but a lot of the things we'd want to do to build a better future anyway will also be things we'd want to do to respond to the climate challenge as well. So there are really positive messages, but they're messages about change. So if you take the view that all change is bad, then you can't reach those positive messages. And yeah, agriculture will have to change to, again, pick that sector which tends to get mentioned in the same sentence every time climate change come up. Agriculture will have to change. That doesn't mean there aren't opportunities. There are better ways of having an agricultural system that's more resilient, that is better matched to local needs. You know, part of this transition is going to be, to some extent, a relocalization of human activity. The globalization that we've got has overshot what is going to be sustainable. So that's going to be part of the jigsaw as well. And that's potentially threatening, but it's also potentially empowering. And we have to look for the opportunities to be empowered by those things. So, you know, I think, sorry, Liam wants to say something. I'll give you an opportunity.
Well, as an informal outsider from the community, I would like to enthusiastically applaud the academic community for this initiative. And it's...
Sorry, Liam is our official citizen in the room.
Well, community I prefer.
Okay, community.
Individual citizens. In fact, I'm from Good Energies Alliance Ireland, and we have been down a footpath on this track, namely the F word, and we have had the task of educating our government, our politicians, bringing awareness to people, the citizens, and also mobilizing their interest. So it shows us, this is in Germany, this is in Ireland, this is in New York. It shows us that these people are our representatives, not our leaders. It is us that have to do it. And then the point was taken, which I have also personally considered, I'm not representing the community on this one, how do you motivate people about 2 degrees means nothing to me? I'm not an academic, it means nothing. And 50 years time, well, I'm going to be around, as you can see. But because of this, I have grandchildren. So I would say to somebody, okay, either do this or your grandchildren fry. That is something that I think might motivate. And then to answer George's question, why are the people in Spain more interested? Well, if you look out the window, you'll see that because they have a lot less rain than we do.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Liam.
And
yeah.
I look forward to.
Sorry, the word that Liam wasn't mentioning there was fracking or hydraulic fracturing, and that would be a whole other day's discussion. But there's an important point there, which is, again, there are citizens up and down the country who are extremely interested, extremely motivated about pieces of this jigsaw, but they haven't been given the opportunity, the apparatus, the system of engagement and consultation individually and in communities to engage with the big picture and see their local concern as part of that big picture and see the trade-offs and all those issues. So I think there's, well, we hope, obviously, because we're making this proposal, we hope that it's timely. We hope that there actually is, if the current sort of latent interest and wish to have this opportunity could just be given an outlet. We think there's many people and many communities up and down the country that would grab it, but it doesn't, it's too difficult if they're just left to do it on their own. They need a structure to fit into and an architecture and, of course, credibility that where they come to conclusions or where they come to proposals, that those will be taken seriously at the national political level. So, you know, there's big picture issues. What's our role in Europe? Should we be in Europe saying, well, we were in Paris, we said we believe that we have to engage with this challenge, and right there, not in the agreement, but in the record of the meeting, there's increased ambition. Okay, we know that the promises or the offers that the parties were making before Paris, we know that they're not consistent with the target in terms of limiting climate change that was adopted. That means that everybody has to do more. Is Ireland going to be in Europe arguing we have to do more and we want to play our part and we're willing to do more? Or is Ireland going to be in there saying, not so sure, we think this is really, really difficult. And, okay, you guys do more, but we don't think we should do quite as much. And for a small country who's basically completely dependent on the big countries in the world acting, surely our national interest is in persuading those big actors to act more ambitiously. But there is no way we're going to be influential in doing that if we're simultaneously saying, oh, and incidentally, we don't think we should be challenged too much because we've had enough. So it's completely in our national interest to do all of these things and to be, yes, brave. Okay, it's not an easy or trivial future, but to open our eyes and look at the future and say, yeah, we want to march into that, not turn our backs and cross our fingers and hope that somebody else will protect us from that. I'm going to ask maybe for a final question, because we're I know people probably have other places to get to. Eric wants to make a comment. Go for it, Eric.
No, just last night we had the leaders' debate, an hour and a half. I didn't listen to it all, but there was absolutely no reference to climate change. The Green Party tweeted this morning that it didn't mention climate change. If you read what John has up there, that should be on everybody's mind. We will have no economy, we will have no society, we will have no security situation to talk about if we don't get the planet right. It's just so obvious. I'm not an academic, ordinary member of Antashka, but I get it. But a lot of my friends don't really, or my family don't engage. The issue that psychologically it's just in the future, let someone else worry about it. But it's happening, we don't do something about it now. So I'm just wondering, can here at this table, can we, it's getting late now in terms of the general election, but the next leaders' debate, can we get RTE to get it on their leaders' debate and have it as an issue?
Well, I don't know if George has any influence, but we've, as I say, I suppose we don't have any excessive, what shall I say, we're academics, we do what we do. We hope to support an informed society and put our knowledge and our abilities at the service of society. Well, okay, I should say I don't want to speak on everybody's behalf, but I consider myself an extremely privileged person in society in having the job and the role that I have. But I want to put that at the service of society as in whatever best way I can. So I agree, I'm pleading, okay? I am pleading with all the actors in society who have influence. That includes the media, but it's not a unique responsibility of the media. But yeah, something like a leaders' debate in an election campaign, surely there should be space to just ask the leaders. You've all said in other contexts that you're worried about this, it's important. But it's not in your manifesto, so what's the story? Do you really think this is important? And if you do, what do you really intend to do about it? What's your idea? You might not like our idea, that's fine. We can take that on the chin. Tell us what your idea is. So I'd love to see that happening.
Okay. Barry, once again, congratulations. I see this as the proclamation of 2016.
Yes.
The proclamation of 2022.
Walk down and take over the GPO, George.
Just one thing, John. The Citizens' Convention, and you've explained quite well, and it's in here and so on, what you mean is an overall conversation going on all over the place from the ground up. But even the title, that's going to go over most people's heads. They're not fully going to know what you mean. Mm-hmm. So if you were to try to explain it to, I don't know, ordinary people listening in the kitchen or whatever else, what is your Citizens' Convention in your words? They might understand.
I think it's a conversation about the future. I think going back to what Ethna said, we have a behavioural problem change to overcome somehow or other. We have a fact that certainly the candidates are not going to be asked about climate change at the doorsteps in the way that we would like to see them. I think I would always argue, though, how many of them were asked about banking regulation 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And it's an issue of leadership, which I think we have to face up to. I think we also have to put before people the costs of doing nothing in the short term. I think we have to actually dangle the reality that the cost of doing nothing is going to be a lot more than the cost of doing something. The fodder crisis cost this country 500 million euros. We've forgotten about it. The floods last winter will cost, I suspect, a similar amount. As Barry said, if we're going to go cap in hand to Europe in the next few years to look for some kind of assistance or relief for coping with climate change, we will have no credibility whatsoever unless we're seen to be making an effort here at home to do something about it ourselves. So I think the purpose of this conversation is essentially to sensitize people to the reality that doing nothing will cost them in the medium term, it will cost their children seriously in the long term, and the cost of actually taking action now and acting now is minuscule compared to the possible damage costs down the road that will be faced, and that we need therefore the leadership to actually bring the realities of those kinds of economic consequences on board and not hide behind a 5-year horizon where if we do nothing for 5 years then things might well work out. I think that's the reality of what I think Barry is proposing and we're proposing here today. It's simply to sensitise the Irish public to the realities of climate change in a way which gets them discussing their children's future, ultimately.
Thanks a million. With that, I'm just going to finally say a special word of thanks to Gary and Christine, my DCU colleagues, who've been busily capturing this event. So thanks very much for that. Thanks to everybody who came in. Thanks especially to the 28 colleagues across the country who engaged with this, and engaged with this, you know, remarkably enthusiastically. It's just been a really pleasant experience for me to have that reaction. Thanks to them, but really just appealing to everybody to use. Everybody has a role in society. We all have opportunities to address this, to use our own roles in our own way, in our own place. So thank you very much. Vote sensibly.